Arts and Antique Radio Show, where your host, nationally recognized certified appraiser Elizabeth Stewart, Santa Barbara's treasure sleuth, will help you put a value on the treasures in your own home.
Every time it rains, pennies from heaven. Don't you know each cloud contains pennies from heaven?
So let's find out.
In 3,
how valuable
2,
is it?
1, you're live.
Hello, 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 Santa Barbara. It's your chantress of everything valuable and beautiful, Elizabeth Stewart. And Katrina Carl at the our art museum sends me always what's going on at the museum. And she sent me this little press release, and I was intrigued. On December 14th at 5:30, we're having a talk by visiting Professor Caroline Arruda, and the nature of the talk is absolutely wonderful. I wanted to let you know about this, dear listener, because I think this is so Santa Barbara. I don't think Caroline knows how Santa Barbara her talk is. And the reason I say this, no, it's true. Caroline is with us and she's going to tell, but the reason I say this, Caroline, is so I came to Santa Barbara about 20 years ago, and I remember sitting in the hot tub at the gym, and there was this distinguished, handsome looking man across from me. And I thought, I need to make friends. I'm going to just get out of my shell. So I said, I'm Elizabeth, and what do you do? And da, 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 da. Well, I manage a bank in Montecito. It's a very wealthy neighborhood. And I said, okay, yeah, I manage a bank in Montecito, but that's not my real life. I said, what's your real life? Well, I make bronzes. I'm an artist. I'm a sculptor. So I figure, okay, that's kind of odd. A numbers person who's got a foundry in his backyard. That's kind of interesting.
Right.
So the next woman I meet, I decided to have my tarot cards read. And I make an appointment with a tarot card reader. I go to her house and I say, how interesting, your library is vast. And she says, yeah, I'm an attorney. I'm a member of the bar here in the States and Canada, and I've tried cases before the Supreme Court. I said, but you're reading tarot cards. Yeah, I'm an artist. That's what I really am. Very high level attorney practicing before the Supreme Court, but she's really an artist. So this was a pattern. As I was getting to know Santa Barbara, this was totally a pattern. I'm this, but then I'm that. And to really cement how Santa Barbara your talk is, Caroline, I'm going to bring up solstice. Our parade every year in the summer is solstice. This has been going on how many years, Richard? 30 plus years, something like that, solstice.
Something like that.
Yeah. So I figure, okay, it's my first year in Santa Barbara. I have to join the parade. So you can volunteer to be one of the artists that makes the floats and paints the floats. So I volunteered. I'm an old scene painter from my theater days. So, okay, I'm going to go volunteer. And then if you volunteer, you get to be in the parade. So I was in the parade. Lo and behold, I'm in a bondage costume. And I'm parading down the street. And who do I meet but my attorney in a G-string? No joke.
No, I believe you.
I meet my accountant, and they're all dressed like crazy loons and skimpy. I meet my hairdresser who's got the Brazilian, feathers.
Right.
And first of all, they all live here in Santa Barbara, Montecito, so they've got to be pulling down a pretty hefty salary. And they're all experts in their field. And yet they're all artists. So I thought, how cool is it that our museum is presenting this talk? And what is this talk? Well,
Go
Caroline,
ahead.
tell us. I want to introduce Caroline Arruda, and I'll tell you how great she is in a minute. But Caroline, first of all, tell us about the talk.
Great. So thanks so much for having me. It's a nice opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about the sort of ideas that I would like to present next week at the museum. So the talk is an attempt to think a little bit about this thing we tend to think is very important, which is authenticity, right? So what are our intuitive ideas about authenticity? Our intuitive ideas are something like the following. Whatever we choose to do in our lives, whatever, bumps in the road life throws at us, we have an opportunity, whether we take it or not is another question, but we have an opportunity to really discover who we most are inside. And the idea is that, at least the intuitive idea is that, we do well in living the good life if, at least in part, we do more of that inward self-discovery. Okay, so not to ruin the surprise, but I guess I will. I'm going to try to suggest that that's the wrong model for thinking about authenticity. That the inward looking model where we discover stuff about ourselves that we didn't know was there is not the right picture. And I think that the artist and our experience of viewing art, not all art, but I think a lot of art, gives us a good model for thinking about what goes wrong with that very compelling intuitive picture. So I guess what I want to try to suggest in the talk is that authenticity is rather about the unusual surprises that come from the outside, okay, that we didn't know that we enjoyed or we liked or that we might identify with, or ways of living our lives that we might aspire to. And our experience of viewing, especially art that makes us somewhat uncomfortable, although not only that, art that we find really moving, or art that we think makes us think about things that we hadn't thought about before. All of these are ways of capturing why authenticity is not about inward looking self-discovery, but I want to suggest rather outward looking, aspirational embrace of new and novel ways of living our lives.
Okay, so when I was prepping for this, Caroline, I was thinking about my 30 years as an appraiser of
Okay.
art.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about all of the times that, so I'm working with the collector, but I'm also, the collector will hire me, for example, or a museum or an insurance company or any kind of corporate collector will hire me to go interview the artist and look into the artist's track record of sales, and to try to get a sense of an artist that they're interested in, what the market level is for that artist. Okay, so so my experience with artists are pretty wide, and I have pretty much categorized, even though that's a nasty thing to do, but I categorize in my mind the artist's creative process in one of two ways.
Okay.
So I look at the artist and I say, well, there is an artist who can only communicate in the medium that he or she has chosen. That's really their, how some kids, they're just kinetic or they're just verbal, or that in many cases the artist can really only express in that particular medium. The other case, the artist is using that medium as a platform for their own self-expression, but their self-expression is they are the art, not necessarily the product of what they produce. So that's the two categories. And then to break that down further, Richard's heard me talk about this, is the artist that, in the old classical Greek or Roman or even Arab style, lets the muse come down. And that's the one type. And then there's the other type that is the Hemingway model, which is the rear end is in the chair at 10 a.m. and the rear end doesn't get out of the chair till 2 p.m. And you sit there whether or not the words come or not, and you stare at your typewriter. So there's the two types. And Richard's giving us a sign we got to go to quick break, but I would be interested to know, you've got this dichotomy, this dualism. Authenticity comes from inside. It's not the authenticity comes from the outside. It hits you like a wave kind of thing when you experience art that's maybe not comfortable. And then you've got this idea that it is not necessarily the inward self-discovery that we disillusion ourselves of here in especially in Santa Barbara, we following many religions that are not our birth religions, and self-discovery, and we've got whole institutes here that are titled self-discovery. So be interested to know what you think about those reflections. And then finally, the idea that the artist is a model, that really kind of confused me a little, because I know some artists who are just wrecks. And so I wouldn't want to be them. And they're so tortured in some ways,
Right.
because they're so sensitive. They must be to do what they do in some cases. Great. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think about that. Richard, are you there?
Yes, Elizabeth,
okay.
I'm right here.
Let's go to a quick break, because I kind of loaded up Caroline's plate.
You got it.
And so before we go to break, though, I just want to mention that I'm interviewing this wonderful woman who is an associate professor of philosophy at Tulane. And she's visiting us in Santa Barbara on December 14th to speak on authenticity. And she's focusing on the creative life. She published widely in leading philosophical journals: Synthese, Mind and Language, Ratio, Australasian Journal of Philosophy, appointments at Australian National University, University of Oslo in Norway. She's recently talking at University of California, Riverside, University of Wisconsin, Madison, University of Vienna, Université de Montréal, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, Israel, Bilkent University in Turkey, many others. She's right now speaking to us from Chapel Hill, where she's at a conference. So the platform that she's going to present us is very interesting, and as you see, has received worldwide attention. So don't turn that down. Back with Caroline Arruda, who's coming to our museum on the 14th. Hey, Richard, let's go to quick break.
Okay. You're clear.
How long is our break?
2 minutes.
Oh, no, that's not enough time. Okay.
Be prepared, Caroline. It's cold here.
Yeah, I saw that.
It's cold. It's a well, California, because you've been here speaking, but it's the kind of cold that you don't really think it's cold, but then it kind of gets inside you. It's weird. It's a different kind of cold than in Chicago, for sure.
Yeah, right. Of course.
What is Bilkent University like? I've always wondered.
I was there for a conference, and I flew into Istanbul, and then I spent some days in Istanbul, and then I took the train to Bilkent, and that was really nice. Everyone said don't do it, but I mean, it's really slow, but it's a nice way to see the Turkish countryside. The university is very well funded, so they have a lot of events and stuff. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, though. I mean, in the sense that you really can't get like into Ankara very easily. So I stayed in Ankara and just took a taxi because I didn't want to stay so far out. The campus is like built up out kind of on the outskirts of the city.
Okay, here we go. Back into the city in 3, 2, 1. You're live.
Welcome back. It's Elizabeth Stewart. I'm speaking with Professor Caroline Arruda, and we are talking about her discussion that she's bringing to us on December 14th to the museum, where she's talking about authenticity, self-discovery, and the artist as an example, our picture of the artist and our experience of artwork ourselves, if we're not artists, how that might influence our own authentic lives. And I postulated to Caroline that I've got, in my experience, many types of artists that I've run into, but kind of two types. One that can only their artwork is their life. Their artwork is themselves. And the other type of artist where they are themselves produce the artwork.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then within those two categories, the artist who waits for the muse to come upon them, and the other category is the real worker bee artist who's got a time schedule, sits there in the chair until that inspiration comes or doesn't come, but works through it and tackles the page no matter what, in the case of a writer, or the canvas. And I want to know what Caroline thinks of that in regards to authenticity, because my final comment before the break was some of my artists that I work with are just wrecks. So please respond, Caroline.
Good. So you asked a bunch of really interesting questions, and I want to make sure that I have a chance to say something about each of them. So I actually wanted to start with something you said before the break, if that's okay. So you suggested that there's a kind of duality in the way that I talked about authenticity. There's like the intuitive model, but the model that I've said is wrong, which is that authenticity is about being inward looking, right? So you might even think about like, all the sort of, interest in talk therapy, the interest in self-discovery, the interest in life coaching, that those are all in a way, it's just slightly overly simplistic, but in a way, they're all about the inward looking picture of authenticity. Discover yourself, who you really are. If you really spend a lot of time, you'll figure it out. And then there's the picture that I'm trying to present, which is that actually authenticity, if it's about anything at all, is really about this outward looking activity that we can engage in, right? That we can look for opportunities to find new things with which to identify and new ways of life with which to aspire, among other possibilities. So I guess it would be, wrong for me to say that self-discovery is not part of authenticity at all. So it's important for us to be inward looking, to reflect on what motivates us, to reflect on the reasons we have for doing things, to reflect on things we thought about ourselves that turn out not to match up with who we really are. But I think that that's less important for authenticity, for whatever we think authenticity picks out, than this outward looking thing. And the question is, why is that? Well, if authenticity is really about our relationship with ourselves, right, then that suggests that we should be future looking with regard to the selves we want to be, not necessarily only inward looking with regard to the people that we were. And I think the old but intuitive model emphasizes this backwards looking picture, but I think it's more about a forwards looking picture. And this is why our experience of viewing art and consuming art and thinking about what artists do is sort of compelling, because those are ways of having novel experiences, things that we can't really control, right? And also discovering things that we might like or enjoy that we didn't know that we liked or enjoyed, that kind of thing. Or thinking we want to be a certain sort of person that isn't really the way we are at all, but we aspire to be that person, right? Okay, so I don't want to suggest it's sort of one or the other. It's just that I want to emphasize the outward looking picture a little bit more, because I think it's been underrepresented in our intuitive way of thinking about what authenticity does. And I should also say one other quick thing. So I think one thing that kind of follows from the picture that I'm presenting is that authenticity, being your truest self, may not actually be as important as we normally think it is. Even though I'm using that word, the suggestion that it's outward looking in the ways that I've described forces us to think a little bit about whether or not authenticity is so important, and then also, and I haven't said much to establish this, I am a philosopher, so I like to try to prove things. I haven't proven the thing I'm about to say, but I'll just gesture towards it. That I think that whatever authenticity described for us in this process we have for the way we should think about our lives, it looks like, if the picture I'm presenting is right, being alienated some of the time is really important for being more authentic. And that's a little bit of a weird conclusion, because we don't normally think alienation is such a great thing. Okay, I'll leave that on the table because I think we'll probably want to come back to that. But I did want to talk a little bit about your pictures of artists that are a mess. I agree with you. They're messy, a lot of people, turns out, are pretty messy, but maybe artists are the messiest among us some of the time. And so the question is, like, why would we want to use them as a model if they're so messy? We don't want to be messy. And I guess what I would say is that the process we have of thinking about them is what's valuable there. We don't necessarily have to want to be them, to think that the way that they approach their craft is illuminating, because they take certain kinds of risks that maybe we're not taking. And so we might just want to extract that bit and not take the rest.
Okay, so just as you were talking, I had some analogous examples that popped into my head.
Good.
And I just want to fly these by you, see what you think. So there's this idea, first of all, that there's a parallel universe a little bit here in behavioralism, versus depth psychology. So you've got this idea of, I'm a smoker, let's say. Either I'm going to go to talk therapy and discover my inward cravings, which happened when I was denied the nipple as a child, for example, and that's going to make me stop smoking. Or you do the behavioralism approach, which is stop smoking. So you've got that. And then I love this idea that you've got this out of the comfort zone launch pad, the what you're calling alienation, this launch pad. You really don't know who you are or who your partner is or who your child is until they're reacting in a situation that is totally foreign to them. In other words, in a crisis, for example.
May I just interject
absolutely
there, because that apologies, but that made me think of something, which is that I think we say that we don't know who they really are, but I don't think that's the right way of thinking about those cases at all. I think what we want to say is that, because sometimes people react in crappy ways and, we don't like them for it. And the question, I think, isn't, is that who they really are, but is that who they want to be? Is that who they aspire to be? And to me, that's a more important, morally speaking, because a fair amount of my work is in ethics. Morally speaking, that's a more important question. But I also think that's a more important question for understanding our relationship with ourselves. Not necessarily did I just react in the bad way, but what kind of person do I aspire to be? And that second question to me is much more compelling. And I think the intuitive picture of authenticity runs roughshod over the importance of that second question, both in the moral and in the practical domain, right? It's not just a moral question, also certain kind of practical implications.
I got to say, I love that. My sister's an actress, and she performed in Chicago many years. She's an actor who brings home the character and then becomes the character for as long as that character is on her head, for example, in a show or play. And so that's one example of, of this, an artist who absorbs a persona, for example, and they've chosen that persona, as you said, a moral decision, let's say, that could be a model for us. And then the other thing that occurred to me is this authenticity thing. I agree with you. This desire to discover our inward authentic selves can be a little sick making in a way, because you've got these I think of some of these imperatives like birth order. I was the firstborn of many kids. I grew up in a huge family. I was number one birth order. And because of that, my parents were not all, in some ways, not totally completely capable as parents because there's so many kids. And so I took over a lot of the raising of some of the most young brothers and sisters that I had. And that really shaped me in a way. And I can't unlive that, you
Right.
know. So I mean, there's things that you know you can't choose that make you. I can be as authentic. I can go to all the talk therapy I want, but it's not going to really change the
Mhm.
fact that, you know, I was in many ways the caretaker for three young kids in my high school years. So, you know, there's that. And I think this is a really cool idea that you say we we don't necessarily have to know ourselves, but we can look at our reactions and actually be sort of self-critical. Is this what I want
Mhm.
to present?
Mhm.
And in that way, I can understand how an artist would be a fantastic model for that because
Mhm.
they are presenting all the time,
Mhm.
you know, in their creations.
Mhm.
So yeah, this outward looking, I think, is so refreshing, which is why I wanted to meet you,
Mhm.
Caroline, because I love this outward look. Um, and I also like the idea that the 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 model that the artist can offer us is not necessarily the romantic, you know, artist in the Goethe style, in the Garrett, self-suffering, you know, sensitive, but the risk taker.
Right.
That's the true
Right.
takeaway, perhaps, not
Right.
the bleeding heart, you know,
Right.
I'm so delicate. I'm an artist person that I run into quite a bit.
Right. Right. And it's less about them as a person than it is about the process. Yeah.
Now, Richard's giving us a sign. We got to go to a quick break. I just want to
Yep.
reintroduce you. This is Caroline Aruda, professor of philosophy at Tulane, and she's coming to visit us because there is no one small community like Santa Barbara in the country, in my experience, that has everybody here. Richard used to say can't swing a cat without hitting an artist in this town. We have
Mhm.
so many people who have they wear both hats. They're professional people on one level, they're tops in their fields, et cetera, et cetera. But they also self-describe as artists. And we have at least three main parades in town every year where these people come out. I mean, all of us come out and behave like crazy people. And it's a very artistic production. This town is full of that. It's really interesting that the museum's found Caroline, talks about the synthesis of creativity and authenticity and risk taking and jumping off the cliff type of thing. So when we get back from the break, she's going to tell us a little bit more about the role of being an authentic person and what the good life means.
Mm.
That's something I'd like to know more about. Richard, let's go to a quick break.
And you're clear.
So Caroline, I had this story about this painter that I knew, and the real Sturm and Drang kind of guy, and you know, he basically out there in the literally to taking his watercolors out in the middle of the storm to try to get the real emotion of the storm. And he eventually uh he'd hardened himself to where he couldn't really feel the environment. I'm a true romantic, you know.
Mhm.
And so what he did was he scratched himself pretty deeply with a knife to make himself feel. I'm like, you're out of your mind. So that was one example of the Looney Tune. And the other example is what set me back for my doctorate, which was interesting. I'm practicing as an appraiser for years, and I ran into an artist who I was counseling in preparation for a museum show. a museum show raises the portfolio value, raises the idea of provenance, increases the artist's exposure, etc. All the market part of the artist life. So I was counseling him to that's pretty formative show for him. And he called me one night and he said, I can't do it. And he said, come over here. I said, I'm in my pajamas. He said, come over here, come over. Jumped in the car, ran over there, and all throughout his studio, he had one of those lofts with beams. Throughout the studio, he'd taken butcher paper and thrown these big rolls of butcher paper over the beams so he could sketch on this paper, freeform sketching, kind of get himself warmed up to actually address the canvas. And it was covered with hundreds of horses.
All right, we're coming back in 3, 2, 1. You're live.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Caroline Aruda. She's coming to us to our museum, the Museum of Art. And by the way, if you're interested, this is the nature of the talk, a little bit about what we're talking about today, but of course, far more in depth. December 14th at 5:30 p.m. Tickets, easy. Tickets at sbma.net. That's what you're going to do to buy tickets for this wonderful talk. She's going to be talking about a number of salient points, but these are the 3 main points that I want to communicate to you, listener. The role of being an authentic person in living the good life. Point 1. Point 2, what authenticity is and whether achieving it requires self-discovery. Love it. Number 3, how our picture of the artist and our experience as consumers of artwork might help us answer point 1 and point 2. Fantastic. In this town, this is really great. In Santa Barbara, Montecito, Goleta, etc., all the Central Coast needs to hear this talk. So we were talking a little bit before the break about the idea of self-discovery and why I think it's time it may have outlived its usefulness. Maybe it's time for a new way of thinking. What do you think, Caroline?
Yeah, so I would be hesitant to say we shouldn't engage in self-discovery at all, but the question is how to do it, right? So one way of thinking about what I suggested earlier, that this intuitive picture we have of authenticity requires this inward looking kind of solitary self-discovery, process of self-discovery, and that's sort of wrong. One way of thinking about what goes wrong with that is that it narrows what self-discovery really is as a process.
Yeah.
So, and it suggests that we only really engage in self-discovery when we dig down deep and find out stuff that's in us that we didn't know was there. I don't think that's helpful. I also think it's probably wrong. I think mostly what self-discovery really is, and this is, to bolster the point that I want to make, which is that authenticity is outward looking. It's about embracing surprises and novelty and new opportunities and ways risk, right? Risk is a really good word. And ways of living our lives that we might aspire to, but are not naturally available to us. So one way of thinking about what goes wrong with the old model is that it narrows self-discovery. So it makes us think that all that stuff I just mentioned, surprise, novelty, having experiences that we don't like very much, okay, that all of those are not opportunities for self-discovery and thus not routes to authenticity. But I think this is wrong. I think most of those opportunities are ways of engaging in self-discovery, but it's not about figuring out what's deep inside of us, but rather about figuring out what kind of paths we want to take moving forward. And that to me is more meaningful and more important with regard to quote unquote being authentic than any of the stuff we might get from looking deep inside. And by the way, I also think that the stuff we might get, the information about ourselves that we might get from looking, quote unquote, looking deep inside is just as easily available looking outward. It just comes from another source. So the fact that you have, an experience viewing an artwork that makes you uncomfortable or something like this this is an opportunity to see and reflect on why those things might make you uncomfortable and decide, do you want to be the kind of person that's made uncomfortable with that kind of stuff, right? And that to me is more meaningful with regard to our capacity to act ultimately, which is the thing we think authenticity helps us to do. We want to act in ways that reflect who we are, but this is a better way of doing it, or at least so I want to show.
I want to mention this idea of self-discovery, and why I think it's time maybe past is because it's a slippery slope, self-discovery, in the process as we know it in our new age culture, which is also sick making in a way. But you get this sort of self-indulgence that kind of happens around self-discovery, and then what it turns into is a weird type of victimhood, I think. And so what you're suggesting, if I'm understanding, is a more reactionary approach. So instead of, well, let's just be kind of unto oneself, start looking around and look at things that maybe make you kind of take you out of your comfort zone a little bit. And that is indeed what some art makes us do. And I always get a little bit of a shock when people say, look at that, my kid could do that. They tell me about this when I tell them a painting is, an abstract piece, for example, de Kooning is worth X, blah, blah, blah. Oh, my kid could do that. No, your kid can't do that. No, that doesn't work that way. And, basically look harder. That's all you need to do.
Yeah, but I would even say, even if it's of course not true in that case that their kid could do that, but even if it were true that their kid could do that, it doesn't show us that it's not a valuable thing to look at because their kid didn't do it. This is an opportunity to reflect on what your experience of abstract art tells you about your preferences, about your relationship with the world, and having that reaction is a way of not being open to those other sorts of things, I think.
That's right. That's right. Well put. So I want to emphasize that Caroline just said something that really resonated with me. Having that reaction to something that is outside of what you think you like is a way of protecting you, yourself protective from developing as a person. So I think that's a super interesting point. Hey, Richard, you're giving us a sign. Hey, Richard, this is a topic that I know you like. I want you to think of a question for Caroline. Richard has written a book very similar to what you're kind of going into, Caroline.
Okay, great.
When we get back from the break, I want Richard to ask a couple of questions, because I know he's dying to ask. I know he is. Okay, don't turn that down. Back in a minute. Caroline Arruda coming to talk with us at Santa Barbara Museum of Art, December 14th at 5:30. Self-discovery is on the table. We are dissecting it a little bit as to maybe there's an alternative to that. And we are going to talk a little bit on December 14th about what authentic personhood is and what the good life is. And maybe Richard can ask a few questions, and then I want Caroline to tell us the question that I threw on the table. What is the good life? We get back from the break. Don't turn that down. Back in a minute.
All right, we're clear.
Great. Well, Richard, I didn't know you had written a book about this. We'll have to chat.
Well, yeah, maybe I'll have you on my program. Tell me your story, New Paradigms for a New World, where we're giving people choices and knowledge of those choices to help make their dreams come true. And I've been doing this program for over 15 years, but I've been interviewing for over 40. And self-discovery, self-assessment, if you will, one of the keys is encouraging people, and we came up with this back in 2019, to spend some time during it was the year of Perfect Vision 2020, then the decade, the 2020s, going within to that quiet, calm, peaceful, still place and listening to that still small voice. And a lot of times it might be guidance, it might be inspiration or encouragement or what have you. Sometimes there may not be any voice and you'll get an impression. For example, I heard my sister's voice after she passed away that day. From my father, I see him, but I don't hear him, yet I know I'm getting impressions from him. And part of all of this is, as you probably talk about, not only in your work, but also the talk you're going to be giving, is that, and this sounds a little weird, if someone were to have been following all of the interviews I've done over the last 40 plus years, they could write my unauthorized autobiography because I share me. I don't have a problem with people knowing that I have high blood pressure or high blood sugar, or I just had a arthroscopic surgery, not recently, to repair some meniscus and this and that and the other, because we all go through this stuff. So who cares if 8 billion other people know? God knows, the universe knows, the divine knows. Okay, Elizabeth, you take it away. And if you want, I will jump in with question in 3, 2, 1, you're live.
Welcome back. It's Elizabeth Stewart. The great pleasure of speaking with Caroline Arruda. When the museum announced she was coming and announced her topic, I begged the museum to let me interview her, and so I am. And she's talking about at the museum on December 14th, the role of being an authentic person living the good life, what authenticity is, and whether achieving it requires self-discovery. That's a really good one. And how our picture of the artist and our experience as consumers of artwork might help us answer both 2 points previously spoken. And Caroline, tell us a little bit about what's the good life?
Well, I hate to ruin it, but I definitely don't have an answer to that question. That's an age-old important question in ethics. What does it mean to lead the good life? But let me try to tell you something about where I think what I'm going to say about authenticity fits into that, bigger enterprise for answering that question. So, typically philosophers want to say, answering the question, what does it mean to lead the good life, involves at least, although not only, figuring out what things have intrinsic value. So value in and of themselves. So just to draw a contrast, money has instrumental value, right? It's useful to the extent that it still has purchasing power, but when we devalue it, it's no longer valuable. But our friends, our personal projects, our pets, whatever, happiness, knowledge, justice, these things arguably are candidates. Okay, we don't know for sure yet, but they're candidates for the stuff that has intrinsic value. It's valuable regardless of how it gets used, whether or not we like it, whether or not it, causes us to have unfortunate things happen in our lives. It's valuable because of what it is. Okay, so lots of philosophers spend a lot of time trying to figure out what stuff belongs on that intrinsic value list. There are a bunch of answers. None of what I'm saying in the talk next week is really a way of adding to that list, but it's a way of helping us figure out, how does our relationship with ourselves figure into living a good life, where living a good life also involves having more of that stuff that has intrinsic value, that my colleagues can figure out the answer to that question. So why do I think that our relationship to ourselves is important? Why am I not worried about whether it's happiness or knowledge or personal relationships or justice that has intrinsic value? Well, I'm not worried about those questions because I think those are questions that other people have answered well. I'm worried about the relationship we have with ourselves because ultimately, listen to the phrase leading the good life. That suggests that us, in our capacity to act as, here's a fancy word, as agents, okay, is really the vehicle for making that life go well. So then we want to ask, well, what does that relationship look like such that it looks better rather than worse? And one feature of that relationship is how, quote unquote, how true we are to ourselves. Well, what I'm suggesting is that how true we are to ourselves is not about looking inwards, but it's about being better at being agents by looking outwards for new aspirational opportunities to be better sorts of people. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but I think a piece that really matters when we think about what it means to lead the good life. Okay, that was a long answer because I had to give you a little background, but there you go. Yeah.
Go, Richard, go.
Well, before we go to break, I think that if I were to answer that question, it would be, first of all, that aspect of knowing self, knowing who I am. By the way, did you choose the title authenticity before or after it was revealed that that was the one word, the word of the year? Authenticity.
No, I chose it before. I
Okay,
have another
very
word on
good.
the topic. Is
So,
it the word of the year?
yes, it is. How intuitive of you.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
it's like it was. I don't know if it was Google or Webster's, but it was one of those two. Every year they will say the number one word for the year
Yeah.
is. Very cool. But I think that when we better understand who we are, truly, authentically, not the masks that we put on,
Mhm.
the better we will also understand others. I've
Oh,
said that we all have the same emotions. Okay. The intensity might be different, but we all have the same emotions. That's what makes us the same. What makes us unique are the experiences behind those emotions.
well, Richard, I actually have to disagree with you.
Okay.
And that's, I'm a philosopher, so my job is always to think about the potential counterexamples. So I appreciate what you said, but I want to say I agree with a lot of what you said, but I don't think everybody has the same emotions necessarily. We all have the capacity to have those things. The question is what elicits them. And so as a way of dovetailing with what you've suggested, you might think that the picture I've presented is like what you just said, an attempt to think of who we are as actually an interpersonal process, not inward looking. It involves our relationships with others and thinking about what experiences we can have that draw out those common capacities is both a way of being more authentic, but also a way of solidifying our connections with others, all in one sort of fell, swoop. So that would be great if we could get all of that in one go. And I'm suggesting maybe it's not as hard as we thought. We'll see though.
Richard, I gotta say it's amazing to me. First of all, do we have to go to another break? Is that what you're saying?
Final break. And if we do that, we can come back and you can say
Okay,
what you
I
need
was
to
gonna
say.
say we all have the same emotions except when you live with a psychopath or sociopath. And then you realize, no, basically. Okay, let's go to quick break. We'll just get a few words when we come back from Caroline. I want to know what she thinks about my concept of when I'm showing people how to look as opposed to see artist and
Good.
art. I call it activated looking. So I make a
Cool.
distinction between looking and seeing. So I want to know what she thinks about that. Don't turn that down. Back with Caroline Aruna in a second.
Excellent. We'll have about 3.5 minutes to go.
Thanks for your question, Richard. I appreciated that.
And I will tell you that I appreciate your perspective on it. I was talking with one of my guests some months ago, and we were sharing our ideas, philosophy, what have you. And I shared a particular perspective. And like you, he said, well, I'm thinking you might want to consider this. And he shared his perspective. I pondered for about 3-4 seconds because, you don't like dead air. And I said, well, there goes another one of my grass huts up in flame. And I'm willing to burn them all down and start over again because I don't have all the answers. I never claimed to, of course. And I'm trying to figure this out just like everybody else. So I appreciate what you had to say. And I will consider that. Although I think that I would have to modify my statement based upon what you said to say that you are correct. We all have the capacity. Maybe that's the differentiation. That doesn't necessarily mean that we all, like Elizabeth just said, if you live with a psychopath who does not have or express certain emotions or has no empathy, that kind of thing.
You know what, Richard?
And I appreciate what you had to say.
I've experienced that kind of personality, and it's interesting because the brain and the mind, or whatever you want to call that organ, it's like Swiss cheese. Certain things go right through the hole, and it's just not there. There's no capability, and it's super interesting to to think about that. But yeah, so okay, let's go back.
All right, stand by. We got another about 15 seconds. Stand by.
Okay.
And you will have a little more than 3.5 minutes. So you go for it.
That's a shame, but that's.
Thank you for having me, by the way. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's been great. I mean, this is something that
Okay, here we go. Final segment, 3.5 in 3, 2, 1. You're live.
Welcome back. It's Elizabeth Stewart speaking with Caroline Arruda. As you know, if you've been listening, this is a wonderful topic. She's bringing us authenticity. And Richard mentioned it was the word of the year. She's bringing us how to be an authentic person by looking at various pieces of art to help us kind of activate what I call activated looking. So you're experiencing something when you're outside of yourself, not inside yourself, but you go outside of yourself. And that's why I love it.
Yeah, the funny thing too is, Elizabeth, real quick here, that authentic is the word. You know who the person of the year is? Taylor Swift. I think those are two mutually exclusive terms, if you will.
Except if you think about the old Greek idea of persona, which that mask is also you.
Yeah.
Oh.
I disagree. I agree with I disagree with Richard. I think those things go together really well, actually.
Okay.
And just gonna give
I'm 0 for 2.
Yeah, another shout out to the museum. Thank you to the museum for bringing this kind of thinker to us. Santa Barbara Museum of Art, December 14th. Tickets at santabarbaramuseum.net, sbma.net. This talk is at 5:30. I know Richard and I will be there. And Caroline, thank you very, very much. And I love it also that you talk about this in the context of an art museum, where we're surrounded by 2- and 3-dimensional imitations of life,
right,
that are more like life itself than life in many cases.
Yeah, I love that way of putting it, and I've actually always thought that. I also think film is like that too. So it's a way of isolating these features in everyday life that we sometimes don't have a chance to really pay attention to. So museums and artwork give us an opportunity to think about those features of life that are there, but probably get lost in the blur of the everyday. And so it's a way of thinking about what I suggested earlier, that authenticity is about embracing these new opportunities, not necessarily only about looking inwards and finding out stuff about ourselves. And if it's about embracing these opportunities, we need kind of artificial contexts within which to think about those in a kind of critical and analytical way. And so it's true, it's an imitation, but it's an imitation that helps us isolate the thing we want to think about, right? That we can't really do in an everyday way too effectively.
Excellent, beautiful, and look forward to the talk on December 14th. Okay, Richard, thank you, Caroline, and thank you. Thanks to Richard. Bye, Caroline. Thanks.
Thank you.
And you are clear. Great program. Thank you so much for being a part of it today.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
I did too.
The end of the story, the artist